Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mr. A.G. Nurani. We are going to discuss with Mr. A.G. Nurani his latest book, The Destruction of Hyderabad. In other words, the process of annexation of this state in India by the Indian government in 1948. Let me ask Mr. Nurani, there were about 506 princely states. How was it possible for the governments to ask them to join the union or the federation without resistance?
Let me thank you very much, Khalid Ahmed sir. It's a pleasure to speak on an event on which you are a colleague. Let me first begin by demolishing the myth that it was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel who brought about the accession of Indian states. The accession of Indian states was brought about by Lord Mountbatten, aided by V.P. Menon. Patel asked him, Patel thought that there would be a revolution, a revolt in the princely states, and all the princes would collapse. And Mountbatten had to tell him they had armies and there'd be bloodshed. So he brought it about by offering them everything except defense, foreign affairs and communication. Now, all that was easy because most of them were, the waves of patriotism did not turn aside in their course and pass by the princely states. They were as animated by the urge for freedom as people in British India. So that was it, Mysore and everybody. Three states stood out: Junagadh, Kashmir and Hyderabad. And in these three states, Kashmir had a Hindu ruler with a Muslim majority. Junagadh had a Muslim ruler with a Hindu majority, and Hyderabad had a Muslim ruler with a Hindu majority. So they stood out like a sore thumb.
Was it possible to allow, or did anyone think of allowing these states to survive within these countries? After all, there are princely states in Europe which are still surviving.
The princely states in Europe are all democratically governed. These states were British creations, as Edward Thompson has written in his Making of the Native Princes. They could not have survived. There was no way they could have survived at all. But may I come to Hyderabad? The destruction of Hyderabad was much more than the destruction of a princely state. It was the annihilation of a Muslim minority and the destruction of a composite Hindu-Muslim culture known as Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb. There was a dichotomy between Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian nationalist, and Vallabhbhai Patel. Jawaharlal Nehru was an Indian nationalist, and Vallabhbhai Patel was a Hindu nationalist. To Vallabhbhai Patel and his man in Hyderabad, K.M. Munshi, the Nizam represented alien culture. With your permission, may I dilate a little on Hyderabad's past and what was its dilemmas on independence. You see, the very word Nizam, no other ruler had the name Nizam. What did Nizam mean? Nizam was really the Nazim of the Mughal Empire. In fact, when one of the Nizams was asked by the East India Company to take on the name of king or Maharaja, he was livid. He said, "Main namak haram nahi hu. I am only an administrator." Now when the Mughal Raj collapsed, the East India Company took over, and then the British Crown. Then the British Crown adopted a funny policy. The Nizam was threatened by the Marathas, by Tipu Sultan and others. He tried to ally himself with the French and then backed out. But the British promised him protection and gradually took away territories from him. Umpteen treaties were conveyed, and Hyderabad was gobbled up and was reduced in size. At the time of partition, what is not known is that Hyderabad enjoyed less autonomy under the British than any princely state did. The Nizam misgoverned. The British insisted that he could not appoint a Diwan without the consent of the British. And here comes the tragedy. The tragedy was that the Arya Samaj, egged on by the Congress, was out to have a revolt. And Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah egged on Nawab Bahadur Yar Jang. And Bahadur Yar Jang's aim was an Islamic state in the Hindu majority area, and the Nizam to be a Khalifa governed by Shariat. So here you see that there were germs of disagreement between the Nizam as well as Bahadur Yar Jang. Bahadur Yar Jang was a perfect leaguer. He was sent to frontier province by Qaid-e-Azam. But he sowed the seeds of this Muslim fanaticism there, and those harvest was poisonous harvest was reaped by a man who was vastly inferior. Bahadur Yar Jang was a man of letters, one of the finest orators the subcontinent produced. Even Tagore and Sarojini Naidu praised him. He might have evolved, perhaps not. However, the Nizam on the eve of independence developed this ambition of being independent. He was never independent. And in fact, in one of his letters to Qaid-e-Azam, he wrote, "We have never been independent." Then why did he aspire to independence? Let me cut it short by saying that in the aftermath, men as diverse as President Ayub Khan and Maulana Abul Ala Maududi said the Nizam ought to have acceded to India. But Qaid-e-Azam wanted him not to accede because he had a strange policy that he would keep Hyderabad out, play off Junagadh against Kashmir and get Kashmir for the asking. And there are two documents which every student of history must read. One is the minutes of conversation between Qaid-e-Azam in Delhi and the Hyderabad delegation, in which Qaid-e-Azam spoke of Imam Hussain and said, "Fight even if you don't have petrol. Fight even if you don't have guns. Hyderabad must fight." Remember, the British fought for long. It was only Hitler who invaded Stalin, and that's how the war. So if the Britain, of course it was a false analogy, Britain fought, it had aid from America, but Britain was not a pushover. Nizam had nothing but a joke of an army. How could Nizam have fought? So he egged them on. Not only that, but he undermined the Nizam in every way by soliciting men from Hyderabad like me, Layak Ali and others, and advising them. Layak Ali was a member of the Pakistan delegation to the General Assembly, and he carried with him letters of introduction by Qaid-e-Azam. This was one. But all this could have been averted. On the 1st of November 1947, and this is a historic document, which I'm very sorry that neither Indians nor Pakistanis have cared to study. It is in black and white. I put it in my book as well as the book on Kashmir published by Oxford University Press. Stopping here, I must mention to you a small secret. This Hyderabad, Destruction of Hyderabad, owes a lot of inspiration to my good friend Mrs. Amina Sayyed. For circumstances beyond her control and mine, it could not be published. But it was she who encouraged me from the word go. Now, on the 1st of November, Mountbatten came down from Delhi to Lahore, a government house. Nawabzada Liaquat Ali Khan was laid in bed with fever, and he gave a written proposal. Where the ruler's religion is different from that of the people, there should be a plebiscite. Qaid-e-Azam said, keep Hyderabad out and I'll settle. Now, how could this have happened? How could India? Because as Professor Reginald Coupland said, India could live with its arms amputated. How could it live without its heart? And here I may remind you of what happened with Kalat. Kalat didn't want to be join Pakistan. In fact, Qaid-e-Azam gave a very wrong legal advice. He was once a counsel for Kalat. He said Kalat enjoys the status of an independent sovereign state. And you'll find in the Transfer Power, volume 12, the British Foreign Office and India Office are shocked. What kind of advice this is? Kalat was not independent. If you remember, eventually, even after the accession, Pakistan had to send an army. These are two nation states. Pakistan could not survive without Kalat. India could not survive without Hyderabad. Now, when Qaid-e-Azam rejected this, what was the situation? The situation at that time was India had occupied Junagadh. And the raiders were on the run. India had secured Uri. The raiders had no chance of recovering. So militarily, Pakistan had no hope of getting this. There was a clause in Mountbatten's offer which said there will be plebiscite by the joint forces of Pakistan and India. In other words, Pakistani forces could have entered Srinagar and organized the plebiscite. But I regret to say, such is the unwillingness on our part to accept that our idols, I use the word idols in quotes, could be wrong, that we are not prepared to accept. I remember a former foreign secretary asking me, Noorani Sahib, I've read your book, did Mountbatten have the mandate? I said, for God's sake, whether he had a mandate or not, what prevented Qaid-e-Azam from taking me at his word? It was in black and white. You know, the very next day, Nehru renewed that offer in black and white to Liaquat Ali Khan, omitting the thing about joint plebiscite, about joint forces. Now, here's a counterfactual analysis. What if Qaid-e-Azam had accepted it? There would have been a plebiscite and the people would have voted for Pakistan, no question about it. Nobody. Because it was said of Sheikh Abdullah that within the valley, Sheikh Abdullah, but beyond that, Qaid-e-Azam. So Qaid-e-Azam had a hold on the Kashmiri Muslims. As far as Hyderabad is concerned, Qaid-e-Azam could have negotiated. Look, just as the French did when they ceded their territories, retained the seeds of Muslim culture, give some safeguards to the Muslims who were overly represented in the Hyderabad state, and make that transition. There would have been no massacre of Muslims. Hyderabad would have remained a seat of Muslim culture, and Qaid-e-Azam would have gone to Delhi to finalize the details. The first head of state, he could have visited the Muslim refugee camps in Delhi, the atmosphere would have improved enormously and there would have been no Cold War. The one poison which still affects us would have been nipped in the bud, would have been. It was diffused. So I believe that there were two people who could have prevented Nizam from walking over the precipice. One was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the other was Walter Monckton. Walter Monckton gave ambiguous advice. At no point did he say, I am going to resign. This is unreal. Behind his back he said, I have a ruler and I have to hold his hands. The Nizam was up to intrigue. As what Mirza Ismail said, the Nizam here is his own leader of opposition. He would make somebody a prime minister and then start intrigue. Because he had developed that art in his dealings with the British resident. And incidentally, when Qaid-e-Azam came in 46, he fell out with the Nizam. And the Nizam was opposed to partition. These are the elements of the tragedy. It's a tragedy in the making because Hyderabad comprised three communities. The Maharashtrians, Karnatikas and Telugus. Muslims were a minority of 10%. It's a tragedy in the making, but the tragedy could have been averted. It was not averted.
As an Indian lawyer working out of Bombay and a very successful author of books and your columns in Frontline Quarterly, you have challenged the Indian narrative on Hyderabad, and you've chosen to call your book Destruction of Hyderabad rather than Annexation of Hyderabad. We would like to listen to your version of what really happened and what did you discover in Sundarlal Commission report. What were the contents of that report which revealed to you the truth about what Indian troops did in Hyderabad? Second question is the Pakistan narrative, textbook narrative about Hyderabad. Do you agree with how we understand the annexation of Hyderabad, or you have certain reservations about that?
Look, Qasim Razvi went on a rampage. He was Field Marshal Ayub Khan's diaries mentioned that in Karachi when he came over after the invasion of Hyderabad, he was practicing as a tout. These are Ayub Khan's words. He was a tout. Now he went on a rampage. He aroused Hindu feelings against Muslims. But the commander, Lieutenant General Muchu Chaudhary, was not communal at all. He was well born and he came from that culture. But you command an army, and that army, you let loose an army against your people. Indira Gandhi let loose an army against the Sikhs, and you know the consequences. To this day, 30 years later, she has not been forgiven by the Sikhs. That Indian army went on a rampage, assisted by the Arya Samajas. And Wilfred Cantwell Smith says, in some villages, all the male population was stood in a line and shot to death. But there's something much more than that, Khalid Ahmed Sahib. In Hyderabad, the graves of Dagh Delvi and his rival and friend Amir Minai exist side by side. That excellent magazine, Islamic Culture, the Quarterly, was published from Hyderabad. Hyderabad had a composite culture, and even to this day, the old Hyderabadi Hindu will tell you how much they deplore the resurgence of Hindu feeling. And of course, there was the resurgence of Muslim communalism. How could you have this Muslim state in a Hindu majority area? The had it not happened, Hyderabad would have bifurcated eventually. Nehru was against it. It was an artificial state. Telugus, Maharashtrians and Kannadas. But Muslim culture, or rather the composite culture, would have survived. And there's another element, Khalid Sahib. The partition created terrible trauma among Indian Muslims. And here I'm afraid some of my Pakistani friends are completely oblivious to the fact that the Lahore Resolution second paragraph, which said that adequate, effective safeguards will be provided for minorities on both sides. Qaeda completely forgot that. So did the Congress leaders. In fact, Qaeda turned his back on Indian Muslims. He told Indian Muslims, and it is there in Zaidi Saab's Jinnah papers, I can't say what will happen to you, but it will depend on the good relations between India and Pakistan. That is what it had come to. And it was only after Bangladesh war that this thing was separated. The Hyderabad was a bastion. The Nizam he used to fund institutions in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey. He drew talent from Bihar. He drew talent from UP. The man had a vision. Even the Osmania University, the translation project was enormous and very promising. All that was wiped out. Within his cabinet, there was a minister, Iyengar, who passed on secrets to Vallabhbhai Patel. One of his old ministers went over to Munshi and gave the secrets. Now, Vallabhbhai Patel planted Munshi, a rabid Arya Samajist, as agent general, and Quaid-e-Azam had this Hyderabadi as a member of the Pakistan delegation. And you know the story of those 20 crore scripts which Nizam gave to Pakistan, and he related. The truth is, a good agreement was arrived at. On the eve of the departure of the Hyderabad delegation, the delegation was surrounded, Walter Monckton, Nawab of Chatari and others, by the goons of Qasim Razvi with the consent of the Nizam. The Nizam's right hand did not know what the left was doing. When the delegation resigned, another went. Mountbatten insulted Moin Nawaz. Have you ever had any experience of negotiations? The trust was gone. But even this is the point I must emphasize. As late as July 48, India made a proposal to Hyderabad which no center has made to a federating state. Namely, we pass a subject on union matters and it will not be imposed on Hyderabad. We give you time for Hyderabad to carry out that legislation. If you don't do it, then we might. The most generous terms were offered to Hyderabad. Nizam rejected it. Like Ali rejected it. And Ali our Jang asked, whatever happened to these people, highly educated engineer, highly educated high court judge, highly educated men like Moin Nawaz and others, they knew that this was going to happen. The documents which I found in the archives which I put in my book is that from February the military planning had begun, and that was well known. First came the economic blockade. So it is as if Hyderabad knew what was coming and walked in. And at no point did Mr. Jinnah said, no. Here I must mention one detail, and there is no aspersion on Mr. Jinnah's integrity, but it is a fact that in March 47, when he knew that India would be partitioned, Punjab and Bengal would be partitioned, he invested nearly 2 lakhs in Hyderabad. Asaf Jahi, Usman Shahi Mills. And you know this investment, how much would it be worth today? This investment by a man who counted his pennies reflected a lot. So, from the very beginning, as far as Hyderabad and Kashmir are concerned, his judgments was at fault. As far as Kashmir was concerned, let me diverge and tell you that Sheikh Abdullah did not want to accede to India. He sent two emissaries, G.M. Sadiq and Bakshi Ghulam Ahmad, to Lahore. They couldn't meet anybody except Mia Iftikharuddin, and one of them met Mamdod. Qaid-e-Azam as well as Liaquat Ali Khan did not hear. Sheikh Abdullah's statements are on record. They have been published in a Pakistani, in the Punjab government publication. If the ruler decides to accede without the people, I'll open the banner of revolt. The ruler was a Hindu, he would have acceded only to India. So, on that fateful moment, I'm afraid, his judgment erred, and Hyderabad's tragedy was a result of that misjudgment.
As you have challenged the story told in the Indian textbooks about how Hyderabad was actually tamed, and the accusation was that you mentioned the goons of Qasim Rizvi. Do you think there was Muslim violence also, which was made an excuse?
It was not made an excuse, it was a reality. In some parts, Qasim Rizvi, who fancied himself as a military commander, he was photographed wearing bathroom slippers, attending an army of women volunteers. The man was a fool. The whole thing was beyond him. He was a small town lawyer in Latur, suddenly pitchforked. But this was the feeling whipped up by Bahadur Yar Jang of an Islamic state in Hyderabad. And in this, he enjoyed the full support of Qaid-e-Azam. In fact, at one Muslim League session, at every Muslim League session, he was asked to deliver his oration. And that he said, I hope we want an Islamic state. If you don't give it, then we don't want Pakistan. So Qaid-e-Azam turned to him smilingly and said, is that a challenge? So he said, it's not a challenge, it's a hope. But you see, the seeds of Islamism was sown by men like Bahadur Yar Jang.
There is also the story told in Pakistan about how a pilot took a plane from here to land in Hyderabad with weapons. What do you make of it?
Well, that was Sidney Cotton and his gun running. There is no doubt about that. It's an established fact. The Nizam was importing guns. And you know what happened when the Indian army invaded? I mean, forgive my saying so, but I alienate my Pakistani friends as much as I do my Indian friends. You don't enter a state with one lieutenant general, two majors general, and umpteen brigade, and one whole armored division, and call it police action. This itself is a brazen falsehood. So, when the army began, the Nizam's orders were surrender rather than have bloodshed. So Al-Adrus surrendered. He met Muchu Chaudhry, and Muchu Chaudhry personally behaved very well. But you know, there's a propaganda goes on. Partition had created bad blood, and 1 year after that. But the effect on the climate, Pakistan was angered. On the eve of Qaid-e-Azam's death, the Indians invaded Hyderabad. The Indian Muslims had a double trauma. There was the trauma of partition itself, and the trauma that this was a seat of Muslim culture, and that is gone. So this is a tragedy which could have been averted, was avertible, and it was not done. And for reasons which are most unworthy.
You have compared the way Hyderabad was annexed by India, and you have sought some parallels with Makran and Kashmir. There is another author who has said that both India and Pakistan agreed at the Simla conference to provincialize Kashmir the same way as Hyderabad. India provincialized its part of Kashmir through Article 370 of the Constitution, and we actually then had Article 19 in the Azad Kashmir. So do you think that there was an agreement about provincializing these two parts of Kashmir?
No. There was an oral understanding, and my good friend Abdul Sattar Sahib, who's written extensively on Simla, the last survivor of the Pakistan delegation or any delegation. P.N. Dhar was the man who in 1992 said there was an oral agreement. And here I may mention, in 1979, Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said there was a secret agreement. And on the basis simply of the published record, I forgot the name of the correspondent, he was very close to Hanif Rame. He mentioned that Bhutto had agreed to accept the LOC, the ceasefire line as an international border, saying just give me time. Just give me time. So I wrote in 79 that there must have been some oral agreement. The last paragraph says, final settlement of Jammu and Kashmir along with resumption of diplomatic relations. Now if you lump them together, that means settlement is around the corner. In 1992, P.N. Dhar, who was Indira Gandhi's secretary, published in quotation marks the conversion of LOC with all the characteristics of an international border. So I asked P.N. Dhar, who was a good friend, I said, P.N., if anybody were to call you and me that we have the characteristics of a man, we would slap him in the face. But this was Bhutto at his desperate best. He realized that if he used that expression, he was pleasing Mrs. Gandhi, but he was not accepting it as a LOC. So he said, characteristics, give me time, mujh par bharosa kijiye. This is a fact, and I'm afraid Pakistani denials cut no ice. At the same time, the Indian claim that this amounted to an acceptance is equally wrong. I'll tell you why. The paragraph 6 of the Simla agreement envisaged another summit. And Khalid Ahmed Sahib, from July 72 till the end of December, both Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and even Aziz Ahmed Khan were pleading with her. That famous speech by Bhutto, probably he'd had one too many. Indira tu meri bahan hai to chhod de. Indira tu aage ja. He wanted the prisoners of war back, and had she agreed, said, all right, I'm coming to Pakistan. Zulfikar, what about that agreement? But she didn't have that vision. And P.N. Dhar gave her wrong advice. P.N. Dhar's advice was settle with Abdullah and then confront it with him. They settled with Abdullah in 75. By that time, Bhutto had increased the armed forces, and he said, forget it. And in 72 or 3, when he went to Beijing, he denounced, he raked up Kashmir again. So 76 by that time. So the version that Bhutto was reminded of it, and Bhutto said, give me time, was absolutely false. By that time, Bhutto had turned his back because Indira hadn't carried out that agreement. But I must tell you something. In 1974, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had a tour of Azad Kashmir. I hate this obscenity of Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Indian administered Kashmir. For God's sake, why not call it East Kashmir and West Kashmir? It's ridiculous. Makbooza Kashmir. Sounds like Kharbuza Kashmir. Now, in what Zulfikar Ali Bhutto did was, he offered 3 options: status quo, provincial status or separate. In other words, he had all but decided to amalgamate Azad Kashmir. And if you read the Azad Kashmir and Jammu Act, you'll find that it reverts Pakistan, Azad Kashmir, to become a part of Pakistan. This is Pakistan government, Pakistan's hypocrisy, forgive my using the word. You ask for plebiscite in Kashmir, but you have ruled out constitutionally a fair plebiscite in Azad Kashmir. Why? The plea of plebiscite is barred in Azad Kashmir. You can only advocate accession in Pakistan. The man has to take an oath of loyalty to the ideology of Pakistan, which is rubbish. There was no ideology of Pakistan at all. Qaid-e-Azam had no ideology. It was a constitutional solution, partition. Ideology of Pakistan was objectives, resolution, and much else crap that followed, and which is poisoning your country today. So, this is the state of Azad. Now, let me tell you something. I happened to be present there. Sheikh Saab convened a people's convention in May 1970 in Srinagar, where he invited papers. He wanted to show some movement, some activity. The papers from Pakistan which advocated independence, the authors of all those papers were put in prison in Pakistan. So, ये अब बेकार की बात है कश्मीर के बारे में, and you rule out a plebiscite for your part of Kashmir, and as far as we are concerned, we make advocacy of plebiscite a criminal offense, which in my opinion is the law is unconstitutional. If I may diverge, the only solution is, it is not fashionable to praise Musharraf. I will say that this man brought Kashmir to the outskirts, to the very gates of a Kashmir solution, and for which history will one day acknowledge his death. And so did Manmohan Singh.
Now, India has awarded autonomy to its part of Kashmir, and you think that constitutional provision cannot be amended. Your stance is that if even the BJP wants to change the constitution and annex their part of Kashmir, it will not be possible.
Khalid Saab, you're right. Constitutionally, Article 370 cannot be abrogated or amended as BJP wants. But what is left of Article 370? With Nehru's, why did Nehru put Sheikh Abdullah in prison? You see, Nehru wanted Kashmir to be on a par with other Indian states. So at Sonamarg on 25th August 1952, he wrote a very cogently argued note for Abdullah. Pakistan is very weak. It can't do a thing to us. United Nations can't do anything. I want the Kashmiris to make up their mind, because your uncertainty and confusion trickles down. Please make up your mind and finalize the accession. When Sheikh Abdullah said no, Sheikh Saab was a Kashmiri, and he had his ears to the ground. He knew what the people wanted. He knew if he did that, he would be rejected. So he set up a committee in May 53 with Nehru's knowledge, Maulana Azad's knowledge, and Maulana Azad's role there also was nefarious. But don't blame anybody else. I proved in my book that the written instructions were given by Nehru to arrest Sheikh Abdullah with the help of the army, and Nehru, after doing that, went about misusing Article 370, what was supposed to be a guarantee of Kashmir's autonomy was misused to wipe out that autonomy. The result is today that 9/10 of the union list applies to Kashmir. So does a large part of the country, and Kashmir has nothing to talk about by way of autonomy. That is not all. The Kashmir's domestic situation is pathetic. It has traitors like Farooq Abdullah and Umar Abdullah, the late Mufti Muhammad Saeed and his daughter. All these unionists depend on their survival, the goodwill of New Delhi. This is the state, and as far as the separatists are concerned, the less about them, the better. Some of them are in your pay as well as ours. And Ali Shah Gilani is a brainless man who knows nothing except a 3-point formula. Make me Qaid-e-Azam of Kashmir. Kashmir should accede to Pakistan, and Pakistan should become an Islamic state. This is the Kashmiri nationalist who told Farooq Ahmad Lagari, ये आपके ख़वातीन कैसे है इस्लामिक, सर पे दुपट्टा नहीं रखते टीवी पे और हाथ नंगे रखते हैं. Now this is the level of his sophistication. So the separatists are a house divided. The only man who has some promise is Mir Wais, but he has to look over his shoulders. The domestic situation is against any movement.
Let us reflect on India-Pakistan relations since the time when the two states were called upon to do something about the princely states left behind by the British Raj. Do you think that a conflict which arose from the annexation of Hyderabad and Kashmir will ever come to an end, or what should the course be which takes us to a resolution and normalization between the two countries?
Khalid Sahib, the only opportunity was in November 1st, 47. After that, Nehru, incidentally in that very memorandum, Nehru had said in 1948, I came to the conclusion that there would be no plebiscite in Kashmir. Yet from 1947 till 1954, he kept on publicly saying, it's our honor, we will not back out. But internally, he had backed out. Point one. Today, Nehru's logic was simple. You send the raiders, you failed and you wanted on plebiscite. But the main thing was 65 war. The 1965 war launched by Pakistan, instigated by Bhutto but acquiesced by Ayub. You have no idea what it did to the liberal opinion in India. Men like, as late as 1964, Jayaprakash Narayan was pleading for a plebiscite in Kashmir. After that he said, how can you give them on the conference table what they have failed to get at their own chosen forum, the battlefield? Supposing Pakistan had made military progress, would Pakistan have held a plebiscite? No. So uske baad to khatam ho gaya, it's finished. Now then came the 1971 war, on which our narrative is false. And today the status quo has become congealed. But there is movement. The Kashmiris long for a settlement. The Kashmiris have not reconciled to the Union. And the biggest obstacle is the obduracy on the part not only of India but Pakistan. Look at it this way. Supposing the 4-point formula, this Gilani and company and all those bunch of, I can only call rotters, don't realize, under that formula, the LOC becomes a line on the map. Sayyid Salahuddin will go back to his Abai Watan. He'll fight elections. The whole situation will be different. The ideas will flow, magazines, articles, columnists. The Kashmiri opinion will be entirely different. And in that opinion, you never know. So what will happen is the sovereignty will remain diminished. But the Kashmiri self-assertion will come to the fore. But people are not prepared to imagine, use their imagination. They are prepared, they are so comfortable. पैसे आ रहे हैं दिल्ली से कश्मीरियों के लिए, ठीक है.
But what do you see in the future? What will happen between India and Pakistan so that the population of South Asia can live in peace and prosper?
Well, on one point, I'm entirely in agreement with my Pakistani friends. There can be no real peace unless and until the Kashmir problem is solved. You see, Pakistanis feel that they've been cheated. So you must settle Kashmir.
Yeah.
And the only possible settlement is the 4-point formula. And I'm very glad that my good friend Khurshid Mehmed Kasuri, after all these years, people say, "Arey, bhul gaye," and he has revived it, he has brought it to the fore. He has given chapter and verse how far they had come. That's the only solution.
I think it's time for some questions. Mr. Kasuri is here. Other people who would like to ask questions?
We have talked about annexations of princely states by India and Pakistan. Would you like to say something on the annexation of Kalat by Pakistan?
As you know, the Nawab of Kalat decided to accede only when VP Menon revealed that the Nawab of Kalat had made overtures to India and India had rebuffed. He was so alarmed by this exposure of his, call it treachery, that he jumped to sign it. Even then you had to send an army to round up things. Yes, the lady behind.
Nurari Sahib, you gave the reference of Wilfred Cantwell Smith. In his analysis of this issue, sometimes you get the feeling that he thinks it's something psychological in the Muslim psyche and relating it to like not just the Hyderabad, but all over like the Middle East, etc. That they can't, their spiritual strength they find great. It doesn't add up to their political strength in the world. He interpreted it that way. How do you see that interpretation?
Would you kindly repeat the question?
So Wilfred Cantwell Smith, whose reference you've given, his analysis of this issue, he sees in terms of a sort of a psychological, spiritual problem among Muslims. The Hyderabad tragedy is due to Muslim inability to see that their political strength is nothing compared to their spiritual strength in this world.
I don't accept that. He's a very insightful writer.